يا راغبا في كل علم نافع.
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Islamic Creed level 3, and we're still talking about al-bid'ah, innovations in the religion. And it's very important for us to learn these principles that we can understand things and make things based on these principles, not just understanding some examples here or there. One of the things that we need to discuss is the different types of al-bid'ah. So even though all of the bid'ah is haram, is forbidden, and it's means of deviation, but some of it is more forbidden than others. Some of it is more deviation than others, like the sins. So that's why when the ulama, they classified the bid'ah to make it easy for a person to understand and to recognize. So they made different classifications to it, whether it's something that takes a person outside the fold of Islam versus not. So there's bid'ah mukaffira, bid'ah that would take the person outside the fold of Islam, as we will talk about them inshallah, versus the bid'ah that is not in that same category. There's another way of categorizing things in which they looked at the bid'ah that whether it has a foundation in the religion or not, or it doesn't. So they call it bid'ah haqiqiyya or bid'ah idafiyya, meaning that it's never been even mentioned in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, versus the one that many people confuses is al-idafiyya, is when the original ruling of it that it's part of the deen, but they innovated something in it, like dhikr, for example, as a very clear example to that, as we will talk about it inshallah ta'ala. So when we look at the first categories of al-bid'ah, which is with regards to whether it's mukaffira or not mukaffira, whether it takes the person outside the fold of Islam by committing major shirk, for example, like people making tawaf around the graves of the righteous ones, and they would turn to them and make dua to them, not to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they seek their refuge, and not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to slaughter to them and not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, this is ibadah done to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the bid'ah itself is mukaffira, it takes the person outside the fold of Islam, and it's innovation in the religion. Other than that, if it's not an act that would make the person do a major shirk, and we talked about the major shirk before, then it's bid'ah, but it's not in the same category. So it's in the categories of sins, but it's even worse than the sins, because again, in general, the bid'ah is worse than sins, but it's not something that would take the person outside the fold of Islam, like celebrating mawlids, or the way that the people make dhikr and dua together or collective, and they add to it certain things. This is, of course, does not take the person outside the fold of Islam, and it's important to know that, so that we don't fall into what we'll talk about it inshallah ta'ala next, which is the takfir, or calling people disbelievers or things like this. We have to put things in the right perspective. The second type of categories, as we talked about it, is, which this is something that requires more knowledge and more understanding. The bid'ah that they call it al-bid'ah al-haqiqiyya, the real bid'ah, meaning that it's completely innovated from every different aspect to it. There's no asli, there's no root to it whatsoever in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That means it's been just invented from nowhere. For example, if someone would create among the Muslimin, for example, the rahbaniyya, to seclude oneself in matters of ibadah, monastery type of things. This is something that the people of the book, they invented, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not ordain it upon them, and it's mentioned in Surah Al-Hadid. For example, someone would stay away from getting married ta'abudan, meaning that he would do that as a way to come closer to Allah by staying away from marriage. when he is someone that can get married and it's feasible for him to do so. And he's not getting married, but the fact that he's leaving it as a way to get closer to Allah. So this is where the bid'ah is here, that he's making it as a ibadah, abandoning marriage as a ibadah, which is of course against the sunnah, the way of the Prophet ﷺ, when he said, وَأَنَا أَتَزَوَّجُ النِّسَاء, and I marry the women, and whoever stay away from my sunnah, he's not one of me, one of us. So also where people imitated the ways of others, where they would torture themselves with all kinds of torture, like people beating themselves up on the 10th of Muharram, for example, or doing things like staying in the garbage containers as a way to humble themselves, for example, as they would claim, or things of that nature, or they would wail and scream, thinking that this is something would get them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no basis to it whatsoever in the deen of Islam, and it's of course obviously something of bid'ah innovations in the deen. Building domes on top of the graves as a way to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some would, for example, be in Hajj in the day of Arafah, not in Arafah, in other places, or initiate things of worship, places where they would go to as a worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained us to do. Traveling to places, traveling to masajid, having piers, these types of things as a way of innovating in the deen of Islam without any foundation to it or any basis to it whatsoever, which is a very obvious thing to those who understand the religion. The second type of the same category here is al-bid'ah al-idafiyya, where sometimes people get confused about it and they don't understand it very well, which is, they call it al-bid'ah al-idafiyya. That means it's added on. What is meant by that is that when you look at it from one perspective, it looks like it's an act of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is part of the deen of Islam. It's called dhikr, for example. And the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are so many verses in the Quran that encourages us to make dhikr. The Prophet ﷺ would make dhikr, and the Sahaba and the A'imma of the deen, and the importance of that. So when you look at it, they're making dhikr. But then, when you look at it from a different perspective, is that they would make the dhikr in a way that is not the way of the Prophet ﷺ. So it has something to do with the deen, but it's innovation in the deen, not according to the way of the Prophet ﷺ. So, for example, when people have these types of salawat, salatul raghaib, salat, the layla of Ashura, the night of Ashura, a specific salah in the night of the 15th of Sha'ban, in general, salah is a good thing. To make salah is a beautiful thing. Nafl salah, optional salah. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, as-salatu khayru mawdu'. The salah is the best thing, the best subject. فَمَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ أَنْ يَسْتَكْثِرْ فَلْيَسْتَكْثِرْ. Whoever is able to do more and more of the salah, let him do so. And let me explain this so that we understand what that means. If you decided to pray at a time when the salah is not forbidden, for example, after salatul dhuhr, you feel like making 2 rak'ah after 2 rak'ah after 2 rak'ah. MashaAllah, this is beautiful. Make salah. Salah is the best subject. But once a person would believe that if you make certain numbers of rak'at after dhuhr, or in that specific day, without an evidence in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, then that action becomes innovation in the religion. A person is changing in the religion. Or the night of the 10th of Al-Muharram, or the night of the 15th of Sha'ban, specific days, or the first week in Rajab, for example, then this what makes it bid'ah. So, and if someone would tell them, why you're doing something like this is innovation in the deen, they would say, we're making salah. We're not playing. But then it is still bid'ah, because this is not something that is according to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And we have even athar from the companions radiallahu anhum, but maybe we'll talk about that later, inshallah ta'ala. Sometimes people, for example, they would recite Qul Allahu Ahad 100,000 times, and they would give it a title. They would say, Al-i'taq al-kubra, this is the way to save yourself from the hellfire, the major one. Right? This is bid'atun idafiyya. It's bid'ah anyway, but it's in the category of al-bid'ah al-idafiyya. Why this category is mentioned, to understand how to classify. But it's bid'ah, yes, it's bid'ah. So reciting Surah Qul Allahu Ahad is a beautiful thing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those who do so. But then for someone to make it in a specific way, and this is where it becomes into the categories of bid'ah. And there is evidences where the Prophet ﷺ, of course, great evidences to talk about this matter. So this is something to be warned against. And that's why many of the turuq or the ways of the Sufis, that it comes under these types of innovations in the religion of Islam. So we need to make sure that we understand these principles that will protect us from the bid'ah. Anything that we do in matters of deen, matters of aqeedah, matters of ibadah, we have to test it, whether it's according to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And if a person, either he's a person of knowledge, or we ask the people of knowledge, those who we trust the knowledge in the religion, and they follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ. And when we say Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, that means we follow the Prophet ﷺ, and following the Prophet ﷺ in what he did and what he didn't do. So you stay away from what he didn't do also ﷺ, because the best guidance is the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ. And as mentioned before, when it comes to ibadat, everything is forbidden unless we have an evidence or evidences that this is part of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And knowing that these bid'ah innovations are evil, and it spreads evil, and it changes in the religion and the life of the people, and to protect ourselves from these, they innovate in the deen till they make the deen like deen al-khurafa, make it like a fairy tale, something that is of no real reality to it whatsoever. And also when it comes to the bid'ah, which is a major bid'ah, and it's referring to the foundations of the deen, or the general terms in the deen of Islam, which they give it the title of al-bid'ah al-kulliyah. Bid'ah kulliyah, that for example, for someone to deny the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, to say we'll follow the Quran only, and they call themselves al-Quraniyun. This is a bid'ah that takes the person outside the fold of Islam if they deny the sunnah completely. And it's kulliyah because it refers to the overall understanding of the deen of Islam by necessity, that it's not permissible for someone to deny, for example, the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in its totality. Or to say that we won't take the hadith al-ahad that did not reach the level of at-tawatur with the different categories of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is also something that is in the categories of al-bid'ah. All of that is forbidden, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from al-bid'ah innovations in the deen. And this is brief, of course, and to practice and to understand and to learn from the people of knowledge of these types of bid'ah, to avoid it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us. We continue inshallah ta'ala with more matters of aqeedah, and wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا راغبا في كل علم نافع
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.